Okay, so chapter 6, Mishnah 6, the last cluster of the 48 things that we need to have in order to be able to acquire Torah. 3 things that the Mishnah is going to conclude with. 3 things that a person has to do in order to acquire Torah. Number 1, hamachkim es rabbi. Direct translation of that is a person who makes their teacher wise. Hamachkim comes from the word chacham. So hamachkim es rabbi, somebody who makes their teacher wise. If you know how to do that, please share with everybody else so we all know how to. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, it says vahamechavein es shmu'asoi, somebody who makes sure that the learning that they receive, shmu'a is what you hear from somebody else, is accurate, is precise. Hamechavein es shmu'asoi, somebody makes sure that the learning that they do is absolute, is precise and is accurate. And the last one is v'ha'oimer davar b'shem oimroi, a person who quotes things in the name of the individual who said them. In simple English, we'd call that quoting your sources. But then the Mishnah says something else. Ha'lamadata, from here we learn, kol ha'oimer davar b'shem oimroi, any person who quotes something in the name of the individual who said it, maybe geula la'olam, brings redemption to the world. Now that's a little surprising because the whole theme of this Mishnah is that if you follow these 48 steps, you'll be able to acquire Torah. And now we're suddenly talking about bringing geula to the world. So how does that creep into this? And then the Mishnah doesn't stop there, but it brings proof to the idea that if you say something in the name of the person who said it, that it brings redemption to the world. Where's the source? Shenemar, as the pasuk tells us in the Megillah, Vatoimer Esther lamelech b'shem Mordechai, that Esther told the king information in the name of Mordechai. That's it. That's the information we have. So we've got to understand, of course, what these 3 different things are and the link between them, because, for example, the Abarbanel says that all 3 of these things are really one and the same, that it's a singular message that the Mishnah is telling us. It's just that the singular message operates in 3 different ways. And we have to understand what is the connection to bringing geula to the world and this particular story about Esther. So why don't we start at the end? Why don't we start first just with creating the context of when Esther is telling something to the king, what Esther is telling to the king, and how that is related to geula. So who remembers? What is Esther telling the king when it says over here, Vatoimer Esther lamelech b'shem Mordechai, that Esther said to the king in Mordechai's name? What did she say? That there was a plot, right? That there were 2 individuals who were high-ranking officials or bodyguards in the royal palace, and they had plotted, Bigsan and Teresh, they had plotted to poison Achashverosh. And Mordechai got wind of this. One of the reasons he got wind of it was because they were speaking in their native tongue, and they imagined that the Persians wouldn't understand them, but because Mordechai had been a member and in fact the leader of the Sanhedrin, one of the prerequisites to be on the Sanhedrin is you had to speak all of the spoken languages of the time. So he was able to intercept their message, and he tells Esther to tip off the king that they're planning to kill him. So she does. But instead of Esther arriving at the king and just simply saying, I've heard that there is a plot on your life, she specifically says, Mordechai told me that there's a plot on your life. Now, how did that bring to geula? We know that the end of the story, obviously, is that Haman is killed and the Jews are allowed to defend themselves, and we have the Purim miracle. What's it got to do with the story, with the poisoning of the king and being quoted in the name of Mordechai?
Mordechai gave them a message.
So, and then what happened? So she said, Mordechai gave the message. How did that help?
The king felt better about Mordechai.
Correct. So the king now had a different attitude towards Mordechai. And more specifically, when we read the Megillah and we get to that section where the king is unable to sleep, Balayla hahu nadadosh nas hamelech, that night the king's sleep was disturbed. We're told that the tradition is you're supposed to raise your voice. As the person reading the Megillah, when you get to that point, you're supposed to raise your voice. And the reason is because that is the beginning of the miracle that eventually became the miracle of Purim. So what happened that night? The king couldn't sleep. So he called over the royal courtier and he said, read to me from the book of Sefer HaZichronos, the book of Chronicles. And Vayimatzei Kasuv, there he found written that Mordechai was the one who had exposed the plot to kill him. So it's a direct result of that, the fact that Esther had said that it was Mordechai who exposed this plot, and then it was recorded in the Royal Chronicles, and then when the king couldn't sleep, and part of the reason the Gemara says that he couldn't sleep is because he was afraid that perhaps people were plotting against him, and he didn't know who he could trust from his inner circle, because here was this party with just Haman and Esther, which made him think that maybe they were building an alliance against him. And he didn't know if there was anybody in the entire kingdom who he could trust. And the next thing, there in the book of Chronicles, it says that he has this man, Mordecai, who saved the king's life. And so as a result of that, he says to Haman that you've got to take Mordecai and parade him through the streets and announce that this is what he's done to the king, to the person who the king wishes to honor. And everything unravels from there for Haman and, of course, picks up for the Jewish people. So there's the link that because Esther quoted that it was Mordecai who had told about the plot, that had a very important role to play in the miracle that was going to follow. Okay, so let's keep that information in mind. Now that we've understood the basics of the Mishnah, let's go back and try and unpack what do these three things mean? Or how do they link together? What does it mean, hamachkim es rabbi? That if a person makes their teacher wise, that is a way for the person to acquire Torah. How do you make your teacher wise? Ever thought about that? How do you make your teacher wise? The Gemara says that it's in exactly the same way as you light a fire. Now, of course, we live in the 21st century, and not that many of us have fireplaces anymore, though it's become very fashionable recently for people to put fireplaces in their houses again. But many of us know that if you want to heat your house in the middle of winter, you just flip a switch and you put on the aircon or you put on a heater or whatever the case is. So we're not used to the idea of lighting a fire. But let's just say that you're lighting a fire. What is the key to lighting a fire? So the Gemara says what you need is something called kindling, which is basically small pieces of either branches or little chips of wood, and they catch fire very quickly. And as a result, they allow the possibility of the logs catching alight. Because if you try to hold a match to a log, it's not going to catch on fire. So you need, it's also the same thing, kindling, right? So you need something which is flammable, that will more easily catch a light, and then that will in turn allow the bigger chunks to catch fire. So the Gemara says students are the kindling and the teacher is the log, which means that the students, because of the questions that students ask, they often push the teacher to have to think differently and to explore and to research and come up with insights that they wouldn't have had on their own. So part of the way that you are machkim es rabbi, part of the way that you make your teacher smart is by asking questions. Now, some teachers don't like questions because for exactly that reason. Well, I thought I understood the topic, and now I don't look so good anymore because you're asking a question, I don't necessarily know the answer, and you have to have the humility to go back and to say, I'll research or whatever the case is. But that's actually how you learn. In fact, the Gemara goes further and says that one of the most famous teacher-student relationships in the entire Gemara was Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So for those people who remember the story, Reish Lakish, as he was known, his real name was Shimon ben Lakish, but they called him Reish Lakish. So he started his career as a highway robber, which is a very interesting career path to becoming a Torah scholar and eventually one of the greatest sages of the Gemara. And Rabbi Yochanan once met him and identified that this was somebody with tremendous potential, and he managed to rope him in to come and learn. And they forged a relationship which is called Talmid Chaver, which basically means Rabbi Yochanan was the teacher and Reish Lakish was the student. And eventually Reish Lakish became such a master that he became a contemporary of his teacher Rabbi Yochanan. And that's why you find in the Gemara that there are many debates between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, even though Rabbi Yochanan was miles ahead of Reish Lakish in the beginning, but Reish Lakish became a tremendous scholar in his own right. So the Gemara tells us that initially Reish Lakish sounds like the kind of student that no teacher wants in the class. Because the Gemara says that when Rabbi Yochanan would teach something, Reish Lakish would typically ask 24 hard questions on whatever Rabbi Yochanan was presenting. But it doesn't say just questions, it says Pirkei. That's the kind of question that dismantles your premise. It's the kind of question that makes you question everything. Okay, now if you're a teacher, you don't want that kind of kid in your class. That's the kind of person you're going to say, maybe you should go learn with somebody else. But then the Gemara says, as a result, Rabbi Yochanan had to prepare 24 in-depth answers on every topic that he ever taught because of Reish Lakish. And as a result of that, Rabbi Yochanan became much more of a master of those topics because he had been forced to go and to learn them in greater depth. So that's what it means, hamachkim es rabbi. By the way, I have to throw this out, just because we mentioned logs that go in a fire. How do you say a log in Yiddish? A klotz, right? So what's a klotz kashya? You know what a klotz kashya is? A question that is ridiculous or unrelated to the topic, or just an outright dumb question. So you don't make a teacher smart with klotz kashas. Right? They have to be real questions. They have to be meaningful questions. Just the person who wants to be that person who's always asking questions. You know the difference. You know what they say, the difference between a shlomil, a shlomazel, and a nudnik. You know what the difference is? Okay, so a shlomil is the kind of person who is likely to spill their soup on the next person's trousers. That's a shlomil. A shlomazel is the kind of person who will be the victim of the soup that spills on their trousers. And a nudnik is the person who wants to know what flavor the soup was. That's a klotz kasha. So if we want to be machkim as rabbi, if the objective over here is to make the teacher smart, then the kind of questions that we ask have to also be smart questions. You don't make a teacher delve deeper into what they're learning by asking meaningless or unrelated questions. That's really important to know. So that's the first thing, and therefore it brings us to the second thing, which is mechavein es shmuaso, that a person has to be really focused when they're learning to ensure that they're getting the information precisely. Because if a student is not getting the information accurately, then it's unlikely that they'll be able to ask meaningful questions that are actually of benefit to the person who is teaching. So that's how you put the two of them together. Mechaven eshmosa, you have to really be paying attention when you're learning, so that you're making sure to get the correct information, so that whatever questions you're going to pose will be related to what the essence of this particular topic is about, and that will assist that not only does the student grow, but the teacher grows as well, which is the ultimate form of learning where both parties are benefiting from the learning experience. But then there's another perspective, another possibility of what it means hamachkem as rabbi. You get two types of students. The one kind of student, unfortunately, and when I say unfortunately, it would even appear that that's become more prevalent in today's world, is the kind of student who will harvest information from other sources and claim all of that information as their own. So rather than saying, I learned this from that place and that from the other place, this person walks around with all of the information that they've Googled and claim that they're now a genius. Now, that is called hamachkim es atzmoi. That means that the person, previously we translated hamachkim es rabbi means you make your teacher wise, which means you actually add to their wisdom, which is a valid interpretation. But as the Barbanel tells us, there's also the idea hamachkim es rabbi means you show that your teacher is wise. So the person who effectively collates information and then claims it to be their own, their goal is to make everybody think that they're wise. Look at me. Look how smart I am. Look how knowledgeable I am. I know all of this stuff. I'm going to throw it out there and everybody's going to think I'm amazing. So rather the attitude is hamachkim es rabbi. We have a responsibility. If somebody has taught us something, to illustrate to other people that that individual is wise, that is the person who taught us these things. That's how I know this information. Which would then link into the principle of hamechaven eshmuasoi, that the person has to focus on what they're listening to, so that when they then share information and they say who they learned it from, if you share the information accurately, then it shows that your teacher is wise. And if you share the information inaccurately, well, then it could have to be a blight on the reputation of the teacher, because I never said that, right? And people are going out peddling this information, quoting that I said it. Now, that would obviously go hand in hand with the third part of the Mishnah, which is ha'omer davar b'shem oimroi, that you're supposed to quote your sources. One of the reasons to quote your sources is to ensure that they have that validity, that the teacher retains that position as the wise person, as the teacher, as the repository of information, so that we're not stealing effectively other people's teachings. Now, on that note, let's examine this from an halachic perspective. And for the first time in quite a long time, we haven't done this for a while, we're going to remind ourselves that Pirkei Avos is not a book of halacha. Rather, Pirkei Avos, as we've seen numerous times, is mili de chasiduso, which means that even if halacha does not necessarily require a particular type of behavior, then what will happen is Pirkei Avos will teach us to go beyond the letter of the law. That's the definition of a chassid. Somebody goes lifnim yishuras adin, beyond the letter of the law. So let's have a look at this halachically for one moment. Let's say that a person hears information from somebody else. So you go to a shiur, and in the shiur, the rabbi tells you a certain halacha, and now you know that that's the halacha. Let's just say it's a law regarding Shabbos. Now the coming Shabbos, you're sitting at your house and you have some guests over, and guess what? This is what a lot of frum people dream of. There's somebody who's about to break the law that you just learned the other day from this rabbi, and you're going to have the wonderful opportunity to catch them in the act and to reprimand them, which is very lucrative for some people, right? So now you're going to chap them, and you're going to say, you're not allowed to do that. That's against halacha. But you don't say, I was at a shir last week with Rabbi so-and-so, and they taught that this is the halacha. You now claim it as your own. You see, I'm the big deal, I'm the knowledgeable one, I'm the frum one, and I'm pointing out what you've done wrong. That is halachically unacceptable. Because the law is, in the same way as you're not allowed to steal a physical item from somebody, you're not allowed to steal a teaching from somebody. You're not allowed to steal somebody's kavod, somebody's honor. So halachically, you are not permitted to share information from somebody else without quoting the source. That's not what this Mishnah is here to teach us. Because there's another interesting principle. There's a principle that the Gemara says, HaTorah nikres al shmoi. For example, if you look throughout the Gemara, you have many, many quotations in the Gemara that are attributed to individuals. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Akiva Omer, right? It's attributed to those individuals. Some of the time, those individuals learned that information from their teachers. Because where do you think it came from? It didn't all come out of nowhere. There were many, many things that these individuals learned from their teachers. So why is it not Rabbi Akiva quoting his teacher? Right? Or Rabbi Yochanan quoting his teacher. Why is it? And you do find that there are many times in the Gemara it says, so-and-so says in the name of so-and-so. You do find that, but not exclusively. So what's the difference? How come sometimes in the Gemara they're quoting their source and sometimes they're not quoting their source? So there's a principle in the Gemara called HaTorah nikres al shmoi, which means that a person could evolve in their learning of a subject to such an extent that they've actually taken ownership of the subject, meaning to say they've delved so deeply into the subject that it now no longer is information from somebody else, it's actually their own information. And in that case, halachically, they are no longer required to quote their source because they've completely ingested this information as their own, and therefore they have the rights now to speak in their own capacity. This Mishnah comes to tell you, well, that might be true, but there's a concept of milit chasidusa, going beyond the requirement of the law. So the law may not insist that now you have to quote your source, but it is still the correct thing to do, to quote your source. Even if you have completely owned this piece of information and invested your own time and your own analysis until you understand it as your own, still it's ideal to quote your source. That's what it's saying. Now there's one other point to take into consideration. What happens, and again this is something that you'll see many times in the Gemara. What happens if somebody learns something from their teacher, and then after that, as one should, they go and they research and they invest in studying the subject further? In other words, they see the teacher's input as a seed that they then develop and mature and grow. So they go and they eventually add their own perspective, their own insights based on the research that they've done. In that case, that person should no longer quote the source, because the source does not include the additional information that they've been able to collate and that they've been able to add to the picture. So at that point in time, actually the person should be saying things in their own name, because then they'll include all of the information that the teacher may not have included. So what's the principle? The principle is amachkim es rabbi, that our responsibility is to show our teachers in a positive and in a good light, to illustrate to the world that these are great people and therefore I've learned from them. And that's really the message over here. That's why I have to be sure that I'm getting the information accurately, and I need to be sure that when I quote, I'm quoting where it comes from. The only time I no longer do that is when I've added to the picture, and now it's not a disrespect to the teacher not to quote them. In fact, to the contrary, it's probably a big asset of the teachers, the fact that the student has become so capable and that the student is now able to add information of their own. Now, there's this interesting principle that we're learning over here, that if you quote something in b'shem omer, in the name of the person who said it, maybe geula la'olam, it brings redemption to the world. So we've got to understand what's the connection between quoting something in the name of the individual who said it and bringing redemption into the world. So let's try and understand what redemption means. And in order to understand that, I guess what we have to say is, what is the opposite of redemption? And don't just use the word exile, because that's what we'll do, right? We'll use the word exile, but let's rather use the word as it is in Hebrew, which is the word golus. So how would you define being in a state of golus? What are the indicators that somebody's in a state of golus? And then, of course, the opposite of that is to be redeemed. So how do you know that somebody's in a state or something is in a state of golus?
There's no connection. They're disconnected.
Disconnected from what?
They're disconnected from their source.
Disconnected from their source. So that might, for some people, still sound a little bit abstract. Right? What does it mean to be disconnected from our source? So let's start from the most obvious and then work our way back. What's the most obvious meaning of the word exile? So the most obvious meaning of the word exile is you are displaced from your home. That is the definition of exile. You're displaced from your home. For us, we speak about Israel, but it's not an exclusive thing for Jewish people. Anybody could be an exile. Any person could be displaced from their home against their will. That is what it means to be in exile. Now let's think about that. When a person is displaced, so whatever the circumstances are, a person is displaced from their place of origin, from their homeland, and now they're living somewhere else. So what does that do? What happens to a person when they're living in this foreign environment? How does it impact their life to be in a foreign environment?
They can't grow.
They can't, even before grow, they can't what? They can't function. You cannot function as you.
I disagree with the word you can't grow.
That's what I'm saying. So we're going to go one step before that. So you can't function in your normal capacity. Because when you are in exile, you don't have the same rights, you don't have the same access to opportunities, you don't have the same language, you're not familiar with the culture. All of those things are extremely limiting. So the definition of golus is that a person is living in a limited capacity. The definition of geula is to be freed, to be able to express yourself as you really are. So now, when a person lives in this world, physically, without getting into anything highfalutin, just physically, the person is free. As long as we're alive, we're free to make choices, we're free to improve our lives, we're free to learn, we're free to grow, as long as we're alive. When a person passes away, they lose that freedom. Even though we always use expressions like they're in a better place and they're at peace, which is technically true, but the fact is that a person, when they pass away, is no longer free to grow and to add to their spirituality and to make healthy choices, etc., because none of those things exist when a person passes away. Now, the Gemara tells us that when a person learns Torah and quotes a sage, at that point in time, the lips of that sage move in the grave. Ever heard that expression? Sif soisav medova voice bakever. That the lips literally mouth the words that we're saying while they are no longer alive. That's what we mean when we say maybe geula la'olam. You're now bringing redemption to an individual who can no longer have an impact on this world, who can no longer teach, who can no longer inspire. And that's obviously a feeling of being very limited and a feeling of some level of discomfort for the neshama. So when we learn something and quote who it is that we're learning from, that helps that individual should be freed from being locked away from this world. That's the one explanation. There's another explanation, which is that the word of Torah, or the teaching that we're sharing with somebody else, if we don't attribute it to the source, that teaching is in exile. It's been disconnected from its source. Now it's just this disembodied teaching that isn't linked back to the individual who taught it. Whereas when we say this teaching belongs to that person, that, so to speak, redeems or rescues that idea or that concept from being lost in the world. And now it's kind of re-anchored to its home, to the person it's originated with. But we're going to take this all to a completely different level, okay? And in order to do so, we have to go back to the particular example that is used to illustrate this point. That kol ha'omer davar b'shem oimroi, any person who says, well, one second, did I translate that accurately the first time? See, this is the problem, because what happens is we know what the Mishnah is trying to tell us, and so then we try and fit the words into the message rather than paying attention to the words to see if we got the message right. So when I first said this quotation, Kol ha'omer davar b'shem oimroi. How did I translate it? Anybody who quotes a teaching in the name of the person who said it. Which word in there means teaching? Kol ha'omer davar. Anybody who says a davar. What's a davar? A word or a thing. B'shem oimroi, in the name of the person who said it. Now that should start the wheels turning in our minds. Hang on a second. So what do we mean if we say anybody who says a word or anybody who says a thing in the name of the person who said it brings geula, brings redemption to the world? We need to understand that. Also, out of all the examples that the Torah could have possibly come up with to quote something in the name of the person who said it, which one did we choose? Vatoimer Esther lamelech b'shem Mordechai. That Esther said something to the king in the name of Mordechai. That's obviously going to be very relevant to understanding what's going on over here, in order that we understand and appreciate what is the real deeper message of this particular Mishnah. So, in order to do this, we need to pay very close attention to the words that are quoted in that pasuk and to the context of those words. So let's start at the beginning. Esther. There is an expression, the Gemara in Megillah, right at the beginning of the Gemara in Megillah, asks this question: Esther min ha-Torah minayin. Where do we have evidence in the 5 books of the Torah to the personality of and the story of Esther? By the way, it's also interesting, the Gemara also asks the question, Haman min ha-Torah minayin. Where do we find Haman in the Torah? But that's a subject for another conversation, because the Gemara links the word Haman to the words that Hashem said to Adam after they ate from the tree of knowledge, Hamin ha'etz. Did you eat from the tree that you weren't supposed to eat from? Hamin and Haman, same word. Okay, different conversation. Where do we find Esther in the Torah?
Sarah. The lands that Sarah ruled was connected.
Okay, it's actually quite apt that we're learning it this week, because the parasha this week is Sarah, who lived for 127 years, and Achashverosh ruled for over 127 lands, and Esther, as his queen, lands up having control of those 127 lands. So that's a link to Sarah, but that's not the one the Gemara quotes. So the Gemara says, Esther min ha-Torah minayin. Where do we find evidence of Esther in the Torah? Is where? No, not Hadassah. So where do we find Esther in the Torah? Is towards the end of the Torah, where Hashem says in Parashas Vayelech to the Jewish people, where Moshe says in Hashem's name, Va'anoichi haster astir ponai. Hashem says, I will hide my face by Yomahu at that time. There's a prediction at some point in the future, Hashem will hide his face. And that is the meaning of the word Esther. It comes from the same root, which is to hide, to conceal. Now, what we know about the Purim story and what differentiates Purim from all the other major festivals of the year is that the Purim story, everything is behind masks. That's why we dress up on Purim, because everything is hidden behind a mask. So you don't see these open miracles like a splitting of the sea, or like the vanquishing of the Canaanites with the sun and the moon, Shemesh Begivon Dom. We don't see those kinds of things. The entire story of Purim is a story that you could explain away by saying, well, it was all about the geopolitical reality of the time, and we had the right people in the right positions, and Esther was the queen, and Mordechai had saved the king's life, so you could actually put the whole thing down to a natural process. So it's a time of Hastorah, it's a time of divine concealment. Plus, we also know that during the time of Esther, or during the time of Achashverosh, we know that the Jewish people were in a state of spiritual concealment. We know that they were at a low ebb of spirituality. There was no obvious connection to Hashem. They had lost the Beis Hamikdash. The first temple had already been destroyed. They were living in a state of galus, of exile. So the entire milieu is all about concealment. Esther. Okay, so Esther means concealment. That is relevant to our conversation over here today. There's another word in there, in this Mishnah, that also means concealment. Which word is it? There's another word in our Mishnah that also means concealment. The word oilam. So what do we say? Kol ha'omer davar b'shem oimroi. Any person who quotes something in the name of the individual who said it, Mevi geula, is going to bring redemption, le oilam, to the world. Well, in Hebrew, the word oilam is related to the word helem, which means concealment. And the reason for that is because the reality of our world is a reality of divine concealment. So I don't know about you, but the last time I drove down the road, I didn't see divine sparks shooting out of the trees, or some big billboard saying Einod Melvadoi, or the beggar at the side of the road coming over to you and saying Hashem is great, or something like that, right? So we live in a world of concealment where things can be really upside down, and people who behave in a way that is immoral actually tend to have positions of power, authority, and influence. So it's a world of concealment. So maybe Geula La'olam really means to be able to shift that. So instead of living in a world where Hashem is completely hidden, we should be able to live in a world where Hashem is a little bit more revealed. Now that's exactly what the Torah is all about. The reason we have the Torah is to guide us to be able to be conscious of Hashem in our world, in our daily experiences. That's why the Torah governs everything about our daily lives, so that we can always bring awareness of Hashem into every single thing that we do. Not only when we're sitting in davening, not only when we're sitting in a shiur, but every part of our lives. So somehow quoting a piece of Torah in the name of the individual who said it somehow should add to this principle of being able to illustrate godliness in the world. I'm going to add one more piece to this. Who is the king in the story? Because we're saying that Esther is going to speak to the king. Who is the king in the story? Achashverosh. How did he get his name? So there are various suggestions that are made in the Gemara how he gets his name, and whether it is his name or whether it's the name of his position, like a pharaoh. But the bottom line is, one of the suggestions that the Gemara makes is the reason he's called Achashverosh is because it alludes to the fact that in his reign, it was dark for the Jewish people. So it's the same theme of concealment. And now Esther, who represents concealment, is going to Achashverosh, who represents concealment, to bring redemption, which represents revelation. So there's a dynamic over here that is really, really important to understanding not only what happened once upon a time over Purim, but to understand what it is that we're supposed to be trying to do in this world. Now, before we go any further, it's important to bear this in mind. When Esther goes to Achashverosh to tell him about the plot, the fact that she quotes Mordechai actually endangers Mordechai at that particular point in time. Because what would have happened theoretically if the intel was wrong? And what if they actually were only talking about plotting to kill the king, but they didn't really intend to plot to actually kill the king? Now Mordechai would have been in a very bad light because he would have been a troublemaker, and he would have stirred up issues against very senior people in Achashverosh's government. So there's a great risk that's happening over here by Esther going to tell Mordechai about this particular, to tell the king in the name of Mordechai about this particular plot, which also tells us something, that there's almost like an element. I don't want to say there's an element of risk over here, but there's an element of doing something which is outside of our comfort zone when we quote something in the name of the person who said it. So, up until this point in time, the way that we've interpreted at a very simplistic level is that when you quote something, you should always quote your source. So that's why people like to say, the Gemara in such and such a place and such a page, because they want to be clear that I'm quoting my source. Or if a person is saying something and it's from the Rambam or the Maharal or whatever the case is, so we mention who it is that we're saying. That would be the simplest understanding of this pasuk. However, there's a deeper layer to this as well. Unfortunately, and this is something that we've seen more than once in the course of the Pirkei Avos generally, and specifically the last piece that we've been learning all about how to acquire Torah, there's a big barrier to acquiring Torah when a person makes it about themselves. In fact, there's an expression, I don't know if you've ever heard this expression, that says, who you are speaks so loud that I cannot hear what you're trying to say. So what does that mean? Sometimes the personality of a person is so much about themselves that you can't really trust them as being a custodian of the Torah. And that's something we have to be really, really careful about, because in order for a person to have access to Torah, and in order for a person to be able to share and teach Torah, a prerequisite is a sense of humility. So now, bearing that in mind and bearing the idea of this concealment, we can start to understand what's happening over here. Because we live in a world of concealment, therefore, let's be honest, a lot of the time, what you see is not what you get. A lot of the time, we're living in a world where what we perceive, what we interpret, is layers of concealment. So, for example, somebody might get up and they might tell us their particular insight, and we're completely inspired and taken by what they've said. In the meantime, none of it is theirs, it's all plagiarized. Could happen. Now, we're living in a world of concealment, so we don't necessarily know that. Not only would it be plagiarized, but sometimes it is possible that when a person gets up to speak, we walk out of there thinking that person is brilliant, which may be true. They may have qualities, they may have traits, but the information that they're sharing is not their own. Torah is not something that an individual takes as theirs. Torah is God's. That's why we start our day by saying brachas over the Torah. And that's why the Gemara warns us that there was a time in the first temple period where people learnt Torah but forgot about the one who gave the Torah. And the reason they forgot is because they didn't say that bracha every single morning to say, Asher nosan lanu, that Hashem gave us as Torah soy, his Torah. Now you'll know this from your experience, that there are some people who get up in front of a room and when they speak, all you hear is them. And there are other people who get up in front of a room and when they speak, all you hear is Torah. Very different personalities. And they could be equally brilliant, they could be equally eloquent, but completely different personalities. So the one person you walk out of there thinking about the greatness of the teacher, and the other person you walk out of there thinking about the greatness of the Torah. That's what it's teaching us here. Kol ha'omer davar, any person who teaches or shares something, b'shem oimroi, in the name of the one who said it. Notice, it doesn't say b'shem rabbi, in the name of your teacher. It doesn't say b'shem melamdoi, in the name of the person who taught it to you, but it uses the expression b'shem omroi, with the person who said it. Who said any of the things that are in Torah? Hashem said it. This is Devar Hashem. It's the words of Hashem. So if a person teaches Torah in such a way that when you're listening to them, you hear b'shem omroi, you hear that this is divine, you hear that this is Hashem. And by the way, this takes us right back to the very first Mishnah of the whole of Pirkei Avos, which was Moshe Kibel Torah mi Sinai, that Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, implying that although Moshe is the very greatest of all teachers throughout the whole of history, he positions himself as a recipient. It's not my wisdom. It's not my words. This is Hashem nosan lanu. This is what Hashem gave us as Torah soy, his Torah. It's Hashem's Torah that we have the privilege of engaging with. Kol ha'omer davar b'shem omroi. Any person who teaches in such a way that when you listen to them, you hear omroi, you hear that these are the words of Hashem, that person, mayvi geula la'olam, is a person who will redeem our world. That's a person who will break the world out of its darkness, who will break the world out of its concealment. Because the problem with our world is our natural inability to recognize Hashem, and the power of the Torah is to shift that ability so that we should recognize Hashem in everything that we're learning, and of course how then it spills over into our lives and what it teaches us. That's really the message over here. Or we could even take it one step deeper. How do we take it one step deeper? Because it does not say over here, Kol ha'omer devar Torah b'shem omroi. Doesn't say specifically that if a person is teaching words of Torah, then you have to quote your source, or then you have to be sure that you're illustrating the divine message in your Torah. But it says davar, which is a highly generic word. Kol ha'omer davar, any person who says a thing, b'shem omroi, in the name of the one who said it, mayvi geula la'olam. In other words, this is telling us if a person wants to master Torah, what they have to recognize, and this is an incredibly important idea to recognize, is that there is no chasm between Torah and the rest of life. There's no barrier between Torah and the world. That is darkness. That is hester, concealment, when we think there's a world and there's a Torah, and they're two different things. And we as Jews are trying as best as we can to infuse Torah wisdom into the world, to create a divine awareness in the world. That's not the correct perspective. The Torah's perspective is Ein oid milvadoi. There's nothing besides Hashem. Not only is there no other deity besides Hashem, no other God, there is nothing besides Hashem. Whatever exists is an expression of Omroi. Baruch she'omar v'haya ha'olam. The one who spoke and the world came into existence. Omroi does not mean the one who said Torah alone, even though that's absolutely true, and it's critical for us, and when we teach Torah, it should be evident that the Torah we're teaching is what Hashem said, and simultaneously we have to recognize that the whole of existence, the whole of the world is what Hashem says. That's why if you go back to the beginning of the story of Bereshis, we see that the way Hashem creates the world is by speaking. So it would be clear that the way we're supposed to look at the world is to see this as Hashem's words in a dynamic flow, keeping everything in existence, or more correctly, as we say in our davening every single day, Hamechadesh b'tuvoi b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh Bereshis, that Hashem renews every single day, tamid, consistently through the day, ma'aseh Bereshis, the act of creation. That's what we're supposed to focus on. So, any person who, not only when they're learning, but when they take their Torah learning into their lives, what they're saying is that this is oimroi, that the world is Hashem's words, and therefore everything in life has to align with what Hashem wants. And therefore nothing in life could actually be a barrier to what Hashem wants, because it would make no sense that Hashem says in this moment that this thing should exist only in order to preclude me from doing what Hashem wants. That makes no sense. If Hashem is right now saying that this exists, it must be then that this would accommodate me doing whatever Hashem wants. If that's how we speak, if that's how we live, if that's how we perceive the world, then maybe Geula La'olam. Then we're able to redeem the world from the state of darkness in which it naturally finds itself. And that we see illustrated in the story of Esther, because when Esther goes to Achashverosh, yes, Esther is named Esther because she represents this concealment that was prevalent at the time. But what's Esther doing? She's taking Mordechai as her guide. Mordechai is the head of the Jewish people. He is the greatest tzaddik of the time. He is, as the Gemara also in Megillah tells us, that Mordechai bedoiroi k'Moshe bedoiroi, that Mordechai was the caliber of Moshe in his generation. So she's taking Mordechai's words all the way to Achashverosh. You know who Achashverosh is? Achashverosh is the guy who says, I control the world. I am, as the Gemara calls him, Moshel Bekippah. He was an international dictator. 127 countries under his rule. So he says, I control the world. He says that this is a world of darkness. Achashverosh, from the word choshech, or at least related to the word choshech, as the Gemara points out. He is an individual who says, they're what God, where God, how God. So Esther comes to Achashverosh with the words of Mordechai, who is the word of Torah, the perspective of Torah, the inside of Torah, and she says to him, Davar b'shem oimroi. You have to know that the world belongs to the one who says that it should exist. And therefore you could be the most powerful king on earth, and you could have your really good buddy Haman who's spoken in your ear and got you to, buy into the story of genocide against the Jews. It's actually all irrelevant because Hashem runs the world. And that's the message for us. When a person takes the attitude and the perspective that they recognize that everything in life is governed by and directed by Hashem, that is what brings Geula to the world. And that is what allows us the opportunity to acquire Torah. Because if we're trying to acquire Torah as something which is divorced from the reality of the world, we're not really getting to what Torah is. When we approach Torah understanding that Torah is there to give us the insight and the wisdom to know that Hashem is the master and director of the world, then we acquire Torah, and then we bring Geula to the world. So please God, in the merit of concluding this Mishnah, and obviously undertaking this great task of Davar b'shem oimroi, we should bring Geula to the world in the realest of senses and bring Mashiach now.
Amen.